Welcome to the France 24 debate. The Middle East war is on its 19th day. The next phase could well be its most decisive, with a perceived split in US and Israeli strategy perhaps emerging, if we can believe Donald Trump's words. He says Israel bombed Iran's gas field without his knowledge. Then Trump, perhaps playing catch-up, threatens to blow up, his phrase, Iran's South Pars gas field if Iran strikes Qatar. A move experts say would literally explode the region, sending backdraft to Qatar, a remark that speaks perhaps loudly of a lack of understanding from Trump and his advisers. Iran is striking the Gulf allies, of course, of the United States, because the US and Israel are bombing Iran. It's almost like a catch-22 situation. There's another issue simmering too, what to do with Iran's enriched uranium. Experts say this is the next big decision for US President Trump. Seizing Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium could well take the largest special forces operation in history. When US and Israeli jets bombed Iran's nuclear facilities last June, the regime was thought to have over 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. This is near weapons grade. Weapons grade is more like 90%. And according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, half of Iran's 60% enriched uranium is stored underground at Isfahan. US intelligence thinks there's a very narrow access point through which this material could be retrieved. Tonight we discuss the next possible phase in a war that sounded more and more like something out of a James Bond movie. What could it mean going forward? Our esteemed guests, let me introduce them to you. Our panel tonight in the studio, Behnam Ben Talebou, Iran Program Director and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
Pleasure.
Joining us from afar in London, Nicole Gojewski, Assistant Professor at Sciences Po Paris and non-resident scholar in the Nuclear Policy Programme at the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you for being with us. In London also, Daria Dolzikova, Research Fellow with the Royal United Services Institute's Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Programme. Thank you for being with us. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Mariana Budgerin, who is Research Associate at the Center for Nuclear Security Policy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, better known to many as MIT. Thank you for being with us. Before I let the panel loose, let's hear from US President Trump saying he will not send troops to Iran, even as 2,500 Marines are on their way to the Persian Gulf.
No, I'm not putting troops anywhere. If I were, I certainly wouldn't tell you, but I'm not putting troops. I wanted to put out that fire, and I said, if I do that, oil prices will go up, the economy will go down a little bit. I thought it would be worse, much worse, actually. I thought there was a chance it could be much worse. It's not bad, and it's going to be over with pretty soon. We've obliterated their Navy. We've obliterated their just about everything there is to obliterate, including leadership. Their Navy's gone, their Air Force is gone, their anti-aircraft equipment is gone. We're flying wherever we want, Pete.
And yet Iran keeps striking back. And as Trump is denying that Marines will be sent to Iran, the Pentagon's asked for some extra $200 billion in order to fund the ongoing war as it is. Let's bring in our guests to get their views on the situation, starting with Behnam Ben Talebou from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies here in the studio. What is your gut reaction here? Clearly, something is developing. There's been this development today about the attack on critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure, which everybody is up in arms about, but nonetheless, it is carrying on. Donald Trump denying that troops will be sent, but he says, I wouldn't tell you if we were. What is your reading of the situation?
Well, today we are in day 20 of this ongoing war with the Islamic Republic. It depends a great deal on how one frames and discusses the objectives. President Trump has said, even before this conflict begun, that his goal with respect to the Islamic Republic is to win, but he hasn't really put meat on the bone as to what winning looks like in practice, militarily or politically. And while the U.S. is indeed defanging most of Iran's missile and military apparatus, going after launchers, going after missile production facilities, the real question of what a political win looks like still looms large. My guess is, and I think the way Washington is shaping up, in the absence of a political win, Washington is likely going to move into the limelight a military win. Now, there's three things that could take the place of that military win that could be sold to the American public. Number one is the data or the statistics of how much damage has been done to the missile program or the offensive long-range strike capabilities. He could talk about the number of launchers destroyed, the number of missiles intercepted, the number of bases struck. 19 of 22 known Iranian missile bases have been struck if you're looking at commercial satellite imagery. So that track record is impressive, and he could claim he handicapped Iran's missile program. Number two is potentially if he sends Marines in to seize the coastline of part of the Persian Gulf, or potentially Harg Island, which is a major oil export hub for the Islamic Republic. And number three is potentially withdrawing or seizing via special forces raid, solo or with the Israelis, or having the Israelis instead seize and then turn over this stockpile of enriched uranium that you spoke about, which is probably not just the 60%, but also the highly enriched 20% as well. And either of these three might prove to be the first possible off-ramp to this conflict as the president looks to have a military win in place of a political win. Which one it will be, we don't know.
And all of this, of course, sounds very much different from the type of issues that Donald Trump campaigned on when he was campaigning to be president.
In term two and in term one, certainly Donald Trump talked about a more judicious foreign policy, but he also, made you could say minced no words when it came to American enmity and his enmity with the Islamic Republic of Iran. If I had to say, is this a war of choice? I would say it is, but it's one that the Islamic Republic started 46, 47 years ago against America, and Donald Trump is at least seems to be intent on finishing it.
I have a question about this whole seizure of enriched uranium, because it just seems too far-fetched to sail into a place, get boots on the ground, go in and then seize this material. But I've got no idea what this means. So let's call on one of our guests to maybe give us some kind of assessment. Nicole, can I ask you in London, Nicole Grozevsky of the Carnegie Endowment, any concept about what this might entail, trying to get your hands on so much enriched uranium and move it out? I imagine this would be incredibly dangerous. That's without the aspect of war.
Yes. This is a complex operation if it comes to fruition, partly because it's not only in the middle of a war zone, but because a lot of this enriched uranium that, as long as we understand it so far, is deeply underground. They remained in canisters under Esfahan. This would require some level of excavation, and specialized teams that deal with radioactive material, whether that be within the Army or parts of the U.S. national labs, that's unclear. But this would also involve a large ground contingent and including quite a bit of construction materials, essentially, to excavate the site. So it's unclear what the Trump administration actually envisions on this kind of operation, but it is definitely a large undertaking.
And in terms of the dangers involved, one has a kind of doomsday scenario sort of etched in one's mind about the possibility of what could happen in the process of trying to execute such an operation.
Yeah, definitely. On one hand, this also introduces a concept of boots on the ground, or U.S. boots on the ground in Iran. Iran is still a war zone. There are persistent U.S. and Israeli strikes. Clearly, those would not be within that vicinity during this period, though it does also open the possibility of attacks by the Iranians themselves. It's just unclear at the moment what this actually entails. And I think this is a big question that's looming over this. Is obviously this ongoing campaign has not solely focused on nuclear assets or the remaining remnants of Iran's nuclear program. It's mostly focused on ballistic missiles and parts of the regime repression. So this has always been the big issue. This was the outstanding issue during the June 2025 war. And right now, this is probably the most, intractable and difficult issue facing the United States and Israel. And whether this operation can achieve its goals, that's another question. If you can recall, back during the Carter administration, the U.S. similarly tried to do special operations in Iran to excavate the hostages, for example. That didn't go according to plan. And so this is a pretty extensive operation. And so there's room for failure here as well. And that's something that I think that the U.S. is thinking about.
Sorry that, Nicola, I butted in, nearly stopped you there, so well done for carrying on. Let's just show everybody the article of the New York Times, one of many talking about this idea of a kind of on-the-ground operation. Let's just put it on screen and sort of just consider that for a second, and also reflect on the fact that the Pentagon is looking at trying to get extra funding Now, if the Pentagon's asking for extra funding, we understand it's like 200 billion euros worth of extra funding, which is obviously a massive amount of money, more than the American aid given to Ukraine since 2023. And of course, since Trump got back to power, that tap has been shut, so no aid going to Ukraine at all. We're talking about a massive investment, massive operation. Clearly, perhaps Trump has a taste for doing these kind of things, given what happened in Venezuela. But this is not Venezuela, is it? Let's face the situation. It is a very different theatre of operations. Daria, can I bring you in from London? Daria Dolzikova of the Royal United Services Institute. In terms of what this means, I mean, clearly, the risk is massive, isn't it, if it goes ahead?
Yeah, well, so I guess there's a few different options for what an operation could actually look like. I mean, it's not entirely clear what Trump has in mind. He's not been particularly clear in what the options are. But, you know, as far as I see it, there's a couple of different things that could be done to get rid of the HEU or other fissile material that might be in the country. I mean, option number one is to down blend it in country. So basically bring it down from highly enriched uranium to lower enriched uranium. So it would still pose a proliferation risk, but a lower one. That's quite a complicated process in normal times. It requires specialized equipment and materials, which do exist in Iran, but what state they're in at the moment and whether Iran would actually support that kind of process is questionable. I would argue that Iran would probably not look favorably towards that. So I would kind of put that option aside, the down blending on site. There's also the option of moving it out of the country, and Nicole talked through that already. Very complicated operation. Not only would you have to locate where all of that material is, you'd have to put it into specialized canisters for moving highly enriched uranium, which is different than the canisters that are used for the movement of commercial uranium. That then raises risks of both chemical risks of contamination, but also potentially if the material is not moved properly or if it's attacked in transport or stolen in transport, you then create radiological concerns as well, potential criticality of the material. So it's a complex, technically complex process, doable. The United States knows how to move HEU, so it is doable, but it's technically complex, more so in a war zone. And then there's the option of blowing it up on site. So basically you explode the material, disperse it, especially if it's underground. Probably practically the easiest option, but you can't eliminate the risk of that material leaking out and causing chemical hazards in the atmosphere as well. So no good options, really.
I was about to raise that very issue, Daria, about the fact that in trying to get rid of this substance, one has to consider precisely what happens on the ground after that, on what's left behind. And clearly, even though there was the attempt to obliterate the nuclear program back in June last year, which Trump said was a complete success, and clearly we're learning different aspects of it worked and certain parts of it did not work at all, clearly, because things have continued to happen. We have this kind of risk which is continuing. If the worst were to happen, Daria, can I ask you more about that, the situation, what would the Iranian people be left with? What would Iran be left with such a kind of massive program to basically explode all that enriched uranium?
Yeah, so again, it depends on what the options are for moving it, but there's a range of different risks. So as I said, if you're actually moving the material across country or airlifting it, and I preface this by saying I'm not a nuclear physicist, but from having talked to a few nuclear physicists, my understanding is that essentially there's the risk of, first of all, if the material leaks, the uranium hexafluoride, if it leaks, it mixes with the water vapor in the atmosphere and it creates really nasty chemicals. So in that instance, it would be a chemical hazard. Which is, again, manageable, especially by special forces. They know how to deal with that stuff. But for the general population, and depending on how far it spreads, which would depend on kind of meteorological conditions, that could pose chemical contamination to the population and to the environment. Again, in a worst case scenario, if this stuff spreads. If the material is also being transported and it's not being transported properly, again, there is technology and there is equipment and canisters that the United States has to move HEU safely. But again, this is a war zone, so unpredictable. There is the potential risk of criticality as well, which wouldn't result in, a nuclear weapon kind of style explosion, but would still pose a radiological accident. Again, I'm talking about kind of worst case scenarios, but when we're dealing with stuff like this and when we're dealing with it in an unpredictable environment in a war zone, we do have to think through the worst case scenarios.
Dari, you say you're not a nuclear physicist, but you provided me, clearly as a layman, with a very detailed explanation. So thank you very much indeed for having a go at that one for us. And can I just say to all of you, if there's a question that you really feel you can't answer, don't be afraid to say to bat it away, and maybe someone else will put their hand up in this group and say, I can deal with that one. Let's bring in from Washington, Mariana Budgeran, who's from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mariana, your area of speciality, I'm yet to learn. However, I'm still trying to find out, what would the effect be? Are we talking about almost something akin to what would have happened, say, in Hiroshima or Nagasaki if all this is blown up in one go? Am I completely barking up the wrong tree? We're clearly talking about some kind of a real huge pollution incident if this substance is destroyed in one go.
No, it would not be similar to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, simply because the blast would rather disperse the radioactive material over whatever territory, if it's destroyed, say, on site. At the Isfahan site, where it's supposedly still is buried underground, if any of it leaks in the atmosphere or, contaminates groundwaters, and so forth, it would not result in a kind of very high levels of heat and radioactivity and a blast wave that destroyed pretty much the entire city of Hiroshima and a large part of Nagasaki back in 1945. Yet this is not to diminish the drastic and adverse effects of such an operation or such a way of disposing of this material. I think certainly a more prudent way would be to airlift it, for instance, if, again, such an operation could be prepared and conceived. I'd like to actually draw our attention to a similar operation that was once carried out by the United States in 1994, and that's Operation Sapphire, that lifted about 600 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium, so highly enriched uranium, enriched to 90%, from Kazakhstan, from northern Kazakhstan, to the United States. So this is sort of the closest historical precedent that I can think of. And that particular operation was carried out with a very friendly and willing nation. So Kazakhstan was collaborating very closely with the United States to get this highly enriched uranium out of its territory. That uranium has been left by a Soviet naval propulsion program that basically, after the Soviet collapse, sort of abandoned it at the Ulba metallurgical plant in northern Kazakhstan. And it involved a lot of people. It involved the involvement of the Department of Energy and the Pentagon. They flew 2 C-17s, these large cargo aircraft. They had to negotiate overflight rights through a number of countries because this is not just any cargo, it's a special cargo, right? They have to bring in specialists to prepare this material ahead of time to properly package it into the requisite containers brought in from the United States so that they could safely be transported. So this gives us a glimpse just how complex such operation could be under normal circumstances and under circumstances when the other party is cooperating. Now, add to that a war zone and possibly, attempts by the Iranians to shoot down the C-17s or whatever the cargo aircraft that would be airlifting this, and the requirements in the military to secure that aircraft over hostile territory to get it out. So that seems to be an enormously risky and complex operation, and hopefully Mr. President is briefed very well on the perils of this.
Mariana, can I just go off piste a little bit? You're based in Washington, D.C. I'm making a guess that you may have voted in the election. I'm making a guess that you may have a strong opinion about whether or not this war should be going on. Now, I don't know whether you can answer my question, but I'll put it to you. Should it be there? And if it goes to a ground invasion, how would you feel about that?
So I'm actually in Boston, but that's besides the point. I'm here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, rather, where MIT is located in my office. But I did vote in this election, and truth be known, certainly not for the incumbent president. My take on this war is that it has very little to do with counterproliferation. It has this particular iteration of it, the joint, Israeli-U.S. strikes that began a couple of weeks ago. They are a regime-changing operation. They're not a counterproliferation operation. If counterproliferation would have been the task, there are a number of different ways to go about it. In fact, as you have mentioned before, the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes, we don't know. Back in June last year, they affected an extensive damage to the Iranian nuclear program. And President Trump at the time boasted that, the program has been obliterated and so forth. So whether it was entirely obliterated or not, we know that it has been set back significantly, without a doubt. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, that has been involved at all the stages of this saga with the Iranian nuclear program, was certainly prepared to go back in and try and inspect the sites and assess the damage and try to. We had the negotiations going on and so forth. So I have no good explanation that pertains to the actual, threat of Iranian imminent acquisition of nuclear weapons that could explain this campaign. And Mr. Trump will have some explaining to do to the constituencies to whom he promised that U.S. would actually draw back its overreach, as it were, internationally, and all these wars that were started with all these other presidents whom President Trump criticized. With the coming midterm elections in November, this is going to be a big issue.
Mariana, in Boston, thank you very much indeed. I made a note of that. Boston, not Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for that analysis. I appreciate you sharing more about yourself and how you feel about it. It's kind of you to do so. Let's take a look at Tulsi Gabbard's words regarding the situation. She, of course, intelligence chief, says it's not her domain to warn the president about an imminent risk. And many people, of course, take issue with her about that, saying it's actually her job to do so. And she said, as a result of Operation Midnight Hammer, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated. There's been no effort since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. If that's the case, they're the words of the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. One wonders why this very war is going on right now. Let's bring in again Ben Talibu, Iran Program Director and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We are where we are. Whether it's the right thing to be or not, of course, depends on where you stand politically and how you view this whole affair. And clearly there were some who will say that the regime in Iran needs to be replaced. Others who would say, well, this is Iran and it's up to us what we do. And we could argue about that one till the cows come home. Let's deal with the sort of nuts and bolts of the war right now. What shape is Iran in? Clearly, it's being battered, but it's still fighting back.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really one of the lessons of Day 20. Again, I want to stress Day 20 because it's coterminous with a 20-day internet shutdown, which is the exact same number of days in Iran that the internet was shut down during really the forcing function for this conflict, which is not nuclear or missile related, but in fact, in my view, related to the multiple red lines that the president politically drew in the month of January at the height of these protests in Iran. These multiple rounds of protests that we've seen boom and bust cycles of. January 2026 was the most demographically and geographically diverse ones. It was the most violently repressed ones as well, anywhere from 30 to 43,000 killed in a matter of 3.5 weeks. On the back end of that, the president promised help was on the way. It seemed like there would be some sort of military intervention. Iranians, which tend to be a relatively nationalist population and had been trying for quite a while to actually replace their regime through multiple iterations of street protest, looked somewhat favorably upon foreign intervention. And indeed, as you say, we are where we are. This is a weak regime, but I want to also stress that this is a weak regime that is still capable of being lethal. Those two things we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time analytically. Sometimes there are regimes that can't win wars abroad abroad, but can still stay in power at home. The situation that I think we have slowly drifted towards post-12-day war, and again, worth ringing the alarm bell on, is Saddam's Iraq, but not 2003, but post-1991, where you have an anti-American, anti-Israeli, oil-rich, subject to sanctions, authoritarian regime, repressing its own people, firing ballistic missiles at Israel, subject to UN sanctions, and potentially not even in charge of its own airspace, while also potentially pursuing WMD. The parallel here is uncanny. So this risks, again, raising the question, what is the overall purpose? Do you have a larger counter-regime strategy? Is it going to look like containment looked like in the 1990s? And I think here the president is trying to, I think the best logic is both defang and decapitate the missile and military threat from the Islamic Republic. How will he nest that into a larger political strategy remains to be seen, but I can't divorce any of this from the forcing function of this crisis, which is the multiple red lines drawn in the month of January, and an attempt by America to put together counter-regime logic, counter-proliferation logic, and everything else that has kind of oriented and animated America in the Middle East for the past 2 decades to try to use the military option, which has increasingly come online against the Islamic Republic after October 7, 2023.
I'm hearing the echo in my head, boots on the ground. I'm also hearing Donald Trump saying he wanted...
Not yet.
I'm also hearing Donald Trump saying that he wants the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow their own leadership. Now, it's one thing, a man in the United States sitting there and saying that. It's a very different thing on the ground. As you point out, it could be a weakened regime, but nonetheless, they're armed, they're dangerous, they're trained, they know what they're going to do, they're willing to be ruthless and kill more people. Is it possible for that to happen? Is it possible for Iran to actually do this by themselves? Or will it need, that phrase again, boots on the ground?
Well, I want to be clear here. The only 2 areas remotely that President Trump has intonated about a potential special forces mission, or perhaps more importantly, leaks from the White House to major Western press about a special forces mission with respect to the Islamic Republic, have been twofold. Potentially about Iran's southern coastline or seizing Kharg Island, or potentially about this operation to extract and withdraw the fissile material. Other than that, there has been no conversation, even remotely, even among the press, even among leaks to the press, about what boots on the ground in this kind of situation look like. But I think Nicole is right here. Even one special forces boot on the ground would risk opening this debate about how much of a moving goalposts are we going to have with respect to the Islamic Republic. And on the protest matter, let me just say, I think the Iranian people have tried. The Iranian people, just, I'll say as a first-generation Iranian American, watching this issue as an affair of the head and an affair of the heart abroad, they've tried. Iran is an Islamist authoritarian government, but ironically, in the 90s and 2000s, you've had eerily high record turnout in Iran, in an authoritarian country, for elections. The population tried to use the ballot box for a very long time to inch things along. That didn't work. They began to boycott that. The more they boycotted elections, the more they took to the streets to protest, and the major domestic sentiment moved from reform to revolution. And this just happened at a time when regime change increasingly became a bad word in Washington, yet that became the overwhelming zeitgeist of different rounds of Iranian protesters, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2022, 23, and now 25, 26. So Washington and the street are now mismatched as to what the potential strategy could be.
Thank you, sir, very much indeed. The United States, of course, not in this alone. Some say it was Israel who actually led it all, and Benjamin Netanyahu led Donald Trump into this war. And of course, you get a different answer wherever you ask that question. Let's take a listen to Donald Trump responding to the possibility that someone suggested to him that Israel might at some point use a weapon that would be, supposed deemed one of mass destruction.
One of your advisors, David Sachs, said the other week that the U.S. should, quote, declare victory and get out of the Iran war. He also warned that if the conflict escalates, Israel may contemplate the use of a nuclear weapon. Has he shared that assessment with you?
No, yes. And Israel wouldn't do that. Israel would never do that. And, there's a theory. You've pounded them to hell, and you could just leave now, and it'll take 10 years for them to build back not nearly what they have right now.
Let's bring in Nicole Grozhevsky who's in London, Prophet Sciences Po, and non-resident scholar at the nuclear policy programme at the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you for being with us and waiting patiently. I know you've probably got so much to say. Can I ask you for a thought about that issue that Donald Trump was mentioning there? He says he believes Israel wouldn't make that step, wouldn't go that far. But it's very difficult, isn't it, in this situation to exactly predict what will happen next?
I think that actually the president is quite correct on this. I mean, what would be the operational use of a non-strategic or a low-yield nuclear weapon in this war? There really wouldn't be one that was actually feasible and even worth crossing that fundamental taboo about non-nuclear use that we've upheld since 1945. That's not necessarily, I think, aligned with just kind of reality. And so I don't think that the Israelis would use any kind of nuclear weapon in this war, and we would hope so. And additionally, if you're looking at even the targeting campaign right now, Israel and the United States are running out of targets in Iran. Essentially, they've hit almost every main facility, every main military facility. To some extent, most of the nuclear facilities, ballistic missile production, even parts of the repression apparatus. And so what would be the utility here? And I think that's the fundamental question that any military planner is asking themselves. What is the purpose of this? And I don't think that there is a real clear purpose of it. And it would really cast Israel in such a negative light that I don't think that that's necessarily what the Israelis would be doing.
I hear what you're saying, Nicole, completely. And there'll be some people who might say, well, why are we actually where we are at all today then, given that phrase? What is the point of it? How is it sort of painting the two countries involved carrying out the attacks that they're carrying out? What was the point of it, given, as has been stated by previous people, part of the Trump administration, there was no imminent threat from Iran?
Yeah, I mean, so the June 2025 12-day war strikes really did damage Iranian nuclear facilities and set it back quite extensively. However, in December of this year, or past year, in 2025, there was a lot of concerns coming out from the Israelis about the reconstitution of Iranian ballistic missile capabilities. And that was actually quite remarkable what the Iranians managed to do and how they were able to actually rebuild a lot of the facilities that were destroyed during the 12-day war. And, produced quite a bit of missiles and that were quite impressive on any kind of international scale when you're looking at ballistic missile production. And that was always a looming threat for the Israelis. And in December, they were raising the alarm there. Obviously, as Benham referred to, is the massive protests that occurred in December and January, where you saw horrific and really egregious violations of human rights and the really terrible repression of Iranian innocent protesters. That was also another compounding factor. And then eventually the Trump administration started talking about the nuclear issue as this was a justification. However, I would argue that a lot of these other factors were the ones that actually galvanized the United States and Israel eventually to make the decision to intervene, and that it's less of a nuclear issue than it is actually one where it comes to Iranian ballistic missile capabilities and also the regime repression.
It's a question of trying to force regime change. You'd agree with that, Nicole, yes?
It depends. It's somewhere between regime degradation and potentially regime change. It just isn't at the fundamental kind of step where you would know that it's regime change or not. But there's definitely, if you look at the targeting pattern, it's hitting most of the parts of the leadership, also the repression side of it, the real kind of internal clamps on power. It's not clear if it's going the full extent of regime change, but it's definitely regime weakening and regime degradation.
Nicole, thank you. Let's stay in London with Daria Dolzikova of the Royal United Services Institute on the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Programme there. Daria, the now dead Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, of Iran, put a fatwa out saying there will be no nuclear weapons. So if we take him at his word, there was no imminent threat, no nuclear weapons being developed. However, there is another narrative which says that this was in the process of being developed. I'm wondering what your insight is on this matter. Did you have any sort of sense that Iran was on the way to creating a weapon? Any sense that there was a threat that would be, if not imminent, then certainly to follow?
If I had any additional insight to what the intelligence community and the IAEA has been putting out, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you about it publicly. So no, I have no additional insight, I'm afraid. But I think if we take, so I think that there's two things worth looking at, right? There's the incentive, the motivation, the political decision, if you will, to actually move towards weaponization and whether that decision has been made. And then there's the material aspect, so the practicality of could Iran have actually rushed towards a nuclear weapon. On the first, precisely as you say, a fair bit of uncertainty. Yes, there was that fatwa that was put out. We can debate, and many have, over how much water the fatwa actually carried. If push came to shove, would the Supreme Leader have justified moving towards a nuclear weapon? I would suggest most likely yes. But the U.S. intelligence community's own assessment, as of, I believe, early last year, was that that decision had not been made yet. So that's kind of the strategic decision-making aspect of it. Again, whether that's changed since that had changed since the June strikes is a separate question. Whether there was more incentive in Iran and perhaps a move towards a decision to weaponize, again, is unclear, certainly in the public domain. And then there's a question of practically, was Iran able to imminently move towards a nuclear weapon capability? And there again, there's a fair bit of uncertainty. We really kind of have to go off of what the IAEA has been reporting. And the International Atomic Energy Agency has been clear over its concerns over the Iranian nuclear program. It had raised issues over Iranian engagement in activities that it could not guarantee were purely for civilian purposes. You combine that with the U.S. intelligence community's assessment that Iran was engaging in activity that would have been relevant to weaponization had it decided to make that step. But at the same time, the IAEA had also noted that it did not have an indication that Iran had a systematic effort to move towards weaponization. So both of those things could be true at the same time. Iran had an advanced program that was of serious proliferation concern and was amassing huge amounts of, relatively speaking, enriched uranium to levels that you don't really need for a civilian program, and certainly not in those amounts. But again, by all accounts, that decision had not been made to actually move towards weaponization, and there was not a systematic effort to imminently move towards weaponization. So, I mean, that's really all we have to go off of.
What's your gut reaction, though, regarding the issue of a ground invasion, Daria, the possibility of that happening? These Marines, as we're speaking, making their way towards this theatre of war. 2,500 of them are on their way. The Pentagon asking for extra money, some $200 billion worth, to try to keep funding whatever is going to happen next in this war. I'm just putting you on the spot, really, by saying, do you feel somewhere, in terms of how you're looking at this, that there could be boots on the ground?
I mean, I won't speculate over whether or not there'll be boots on the ground, but I can certainly speak to my gut reaction to having a ground operation for counter-proliferation purposes. And I think, you know, the others on the panel have laid this out well, that it won't be a simple operation. I think the U.S. runs the risk of really getting itself into a complicated quagmire here. You know, to secure Iran's nuclear program at this point, and I've said this before, there will need to be a ground presence because there will have to be people that go into all of these facilities, find facilities that might not have been identified previously, evaluate them, secure the material, et cetera. That needs to have an on-the-ground presence. That presence does not have to be a military presence. We've seen in Iraq, the UN had gone in, the IAEA had gone in to conduct, to monitor and to verify and to inspect various facilities and to destroy material and sites. And actually, they'd be a lot better placed, those technical agencies, to conduct that kind of work. And it'll be a very lengthy process. And I don't know that we want it to be a military one, not to mention the fact that it would be an illegal invasion in that instance. So that's my gut reaction to the counter-proliferation effectiveness of boots on the ground, which I don't think will be particularly effective and run the risk of a quagmire.
Daria, thank you for your assessment, and I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot with that one, which isn't strictly within your remit, I understand, but you're here, so I asked you, so thank you for giving me that answer. I really appreciate it. The World Health Organization is preparing for the worst. Article that we spotted in Politico talking about the preparations that are underway. We can show you the headline of that article, worst case scenarios we're talking about there. Staff prepared for a nuclear incident in its broader sense. Let's go back to Boston. Mariana Budgeran there from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When you see things like that, the WHO, no less, saying they're preparing for the worst case scenario, it does make you think, doesn't it?
It certainly does, but it's also encouraging that we don't wait until the disaster strikes to prepare for it, right? Preparedness is good policy all around for, any eventuality in an armed conflict, especially the one that has nuclear facilities containing nuclear materials on the ground there. So it is both anxiety-inducing, but also encouraging in the sense that we better be prepared than not. A lesson. Another country that's very close to my heart, Ukraine, where I'm originally from before I made it over to Boston, is learning the hard way, right? It is also another country that has found, with many civilian nuclear facilities, found itself in the middle of armed conflict and is now in the middle of a war, trying to bolster its preparedness for any sort of, nuclear-related accident or eventuality when its resources are already stretched to the ground, the ones that concern the nuclear power plants, but also, possible use of a tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapon in the conflict.
And that situation is one that I think preoccupies many people's minds because one doesn't know what will happen next. One can see that it makes no sense to deploy such weapons, Mariana, but we're not in the minds of the leaders concerned. And sometimes with the people around them just saying, yes, boss, you're right, boss. Yes, boss, you're right, boss. These things can escalate.
Especially when you're talking to rather tyrannical authoritarian leaders, right, that do not like to hear bad news, and oftentimes the reporting up the chain of command is rather filtered toward things that those leaders want to hear, rather than the actual true state of affairs. But let me address somewhat, I have a little bit of a dissenting view about the utility of the use of nuclear weapons in any conflict. I do agree that, the battlefield utility of any nuclear use in Iran or, let's say, in the Ukrainian war is very limited. So the types of nuclear objectives and nuclear assets that could be destroyed by that certainly could be A, destroyed by conventional means, B, would bring little additional utility by using a nuclear weapon, crossing that red line, violating the taboo, and achieving what? However, as long as nuclear weapons exist, there's always some residual risk that a leader might decide to use them. Not only because, not even primarily because they're crazy, irrational, and so forth, but because there are other ways to use nuclear weapons. And let's remember, last time nuclear, and the only time, fortunately, nuclear weapons
Mariana,
were
I
used.
need to cut you off. Benjamin Netanyahu is giving a press conference now. It could be interesting. Thank you so much.